Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. I'm John Hilbolt, Director of Lectures and Seminars, and my duties, number one, are to ask that our cell phones be turned off as a courtesy as we prepare to begin. Reminding our internet viewers as well and those joining us on C-SPAN that questions are welcome via email, simply addressing speaker@heritage.org. We, of course, will post the program later today for your future reference on our website. And our host for today is Peter Brooks, who serves Heritage as a senior fellow in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy and Defense Studies. Mr. Brooks is also in his fourth term as a member of the Congressional U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He has been appointed to that commission by two different speakers of the House. Prior to coming to Heritage, Dr. Brooks served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs in the George W. Bush administration. He has served on Republican staff on the Committee on International Relations in the U.S. House of Representatives, worked at the Central Intelligence Agency, at the State Department, in the private sector at several defense firms, and on active duty in the U.S. Navy. He is a graduate of Georgetown University, Johns Hopkins, and the U.S. Naval Academy. Please join me in welcoming Peter Brooks. Peter?
Thank you. Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. As you know from the news, Iraq is in crisis and has been for some time now. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS or ISIL, or Islamic State, has scored victories against Iraqi and Kurdish forces, taken and held territory, captured vital infrastructure, and left a wake of death and destruction across Iraq. Not to mention that it has also declared the establishment of a caliphate that spans both Iraq and Syria. There are serious questions about the Iraqi government's ability to govern the country, and more importantly, in the meantime, to handle the threat the Islamic State poses to peace and stability. In addition, it's my view that the rise of ISIS poses a direct threat to the national interest and security of the United States abroad and at home. Without question, some of the reports and videos about the Islamic State are chilling and deeply disturbing. As a consequence, a discussion of the President's strategy in Iraq is both timely and necessary. For instance, has the U.S. response been sufficient in addressing the ISIS threat thus far? What interests does the United States have in Iraq, and do they merit increased U.S. involvement? What should the President's strategy in Iraq and ISIS be going forward? These are just some of the pressing issues and questions that we need to answer in this evolving and, I would argue, worsening crisis. Indeed, just an hour ago, the President spoke on Iraq in a televised address. Fortunately, we've been able to assemble a terrific panel, even at this in the middle of August, to get at the matter of Iraq, ISIS, and other related issues today. Joining me is Steve Hadley. He's a former assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, or what is commonly known as the National Security Advisor, to President George W. Bush. Dr. Mary Haybeck. She's a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior fellow at FPRI. And Dr. Steve Bucci, director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. We've got a lot to cover in a short period on an important topic, so let's get started. Steve Bucci, you want to lead us off and give us some thoughts on the topic at hand?
Yeah, first I want to thank everybody for being here. And it's an honor for me always to sit next to Mary on a panel because she is just, truly one of the treasures of America as far as her expertise in al-Qaeda and the subject of Islamic extremism, and to be on the panel with Steve as well, who I had the pleasure of watching do his work at the lofty heights to which he did it during the Bush administration. I'm sort of the light entertainment before they get up, and I'm actually not going to talk to you as so much as Dr. Bucci, as retired Colonel Bucci, United States Army Special Forces, where I spent about 28 years of my life, looking at what we're doing in Iraq right now to try and combat ISIS. First, kudos to the President that he's doing something. That we are taking some action. The humanitarian effort to help relieve the Yazidis up on Mount Sinjar was the right thing to do, as were the airstrikes that have occurred. But to be honest with you, I don't think it's enough. I am not advocating that we suddenly redeploy Marine divisions and the 82nd Airborne Division to Iraq. I don't think we need to do that, and I don't think there's any appetite for it. However, there is some middle ground between those two positions, and what I would like to advocate is taking an action that I would call sort of a combination of Gulf War I and the beginning of the Afghan campaign, where we leverage allies in the region, both the Kurds, the Iraqi military, some of the various confessional militias, and hopefully some folks from some other countries, Jordan, Turkey, maybe Saudi Arabia. Not real thrilled about Iran getting involved in it. But then embed with those forces some of our special operations forces to control American or allied air assets to go after ISIS in a much bigger way than we're doing right now. Similar to what we did in Afghanistan against the Taliban, where we were embedded with units like the Northern Alliance, with a very small American footprint on the ground, but a lot of air assets using precision munitions. We basically took the Taliban apart and drove them out of power in Afghanistan. I believe ISIS is a significant enough threat, not just to Iraq, but to the region, that we need to take a little more stringent measures than we have. We need to have a goal of the destruction of ISIS. They are that dangerous, in my opinion. And we need to send a message to the world that, yes, America may be war-weary, but we're not totally sitting it out with our feet up in the air, that if when the situation warrants it, and I believe this one does, we do take some action. I'll stop right there.
Thank you. I'd just like to add a little bit of the justification for the fears that many have expressed about ISIS. I think that one of the maybe miscommunications might be that we're just dealing with a humanitarian crisis, when in fact we're dealing with a humanitarian crisis and a direct threat to the United States. So the humanitarian crisis is, of course, bad enough on its own. We're talking about hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. We don't even know the full scope of the tragedy that we're facing. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that ISIS was thrown out of al-Qaeda for being too extreme. So we're dealing with people that even al-Qaeda found distasteful, and whose actions have lived up to this reputation once they found themselves in control of territory. So I don't want to minimize the humanitarian crisis or the fate of the people of Iraq who have found themselves under their very unkind and ungentle rule. But at the same time, there's also a direct threat to the United States. It's been expressed by ISIS itself. They have threatened to carry out attacks against the U.S. And U.S. interests. In addition, they have threatened to carry out attacks against nearly all of their neighbors. In fact, one of the, if you want to put it this way, beefs that they had with al-Qaeda was that they tried to prevent them from spreading their war beyond the boundaries of Iraq, and specifically named Iran, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and several other countries as the targets of their attacks. And sure enough, a couple months ago, a huge cell of more than 50, 60 men were picked up in Saudi Arabia plotting attacks against the Saudis. And there have been other hints of plots that they've had going forward in other countries. So it's not just the United States that's threatened. It's not just Iraq that's threatened. It's the region as well that's threatened. And they really want their war to go beyond the boundaries that it's currently in. So the short answer about why we need to pay attention here is not just for the humanitarian crisis or the regional war, but for our own safety and security. But there's a second piece to this, and that is there is no one else to do this. Even though our allies have expressed willingness to be involved, even though the UN has expressed their horror at what is going on in Iraq, no one else has the capabilities to do anything meaningful in this situation. So why do we need to be involved? For our own security and safety, and because we're the only ones who can do it. And then I guess the big question is, what precisely should we be doing? And we've heard Steve give an answer that I think is quite eloquent about the need to be doing more. Bombing, unfortunately, is an imprecise sort of solution to this particular problem, and it'll only be a temporary one. So there's no way to stabilize even the situation with simply bombing. And by the way, as Steve also mentioned, what is our ultimate goal for being there? If our ultimate goal is simply to prevent a humanitarian crisis, then maybe one could make an argument that helping the Kurds will, or aiding the Kurds so that they can deal with this problem, or carrying out a bombing campaign will at least alleviate the immediate humanitarian crisis. But if the problem is that these extremists pose a direct threat to the United States, a bombing campaign, useful as it is to temporarily stabilize the situation, will not, in fact, defeat ISIS or secure the safety of the United States. Now, I have some proposals here, but I would prefer to perhaps leave them for a more lengthy discussion in just a little bit. So,
Thank you. Steve?
I think it's, this starts out with Iraq, and I think if we start there, we miss some of the explanation of why we're in the situation we're in, which we need to understand if we're going to actually deal with it. Iraq in 2008, the al-Qaeda in Iraq had, largely thanks to the surge and the efforts of our men and women in uniform in 2007, 2008, al-Qaeda in Iraq was largely defeated. The country was stable. It continued to be so until 2011. A lot of problems with the government, a lot of problems with what was going on, but stable it was. The change, of course, became Syria. And it began the initially peaceful uprising against the Syrian government, which turned violent and has been raging now for over 3 years. A number of us said from the very beginning, Republicans and Democrats, that the longer Syria goes, the more people will die, the more extremist it will become, the more it will destabilize its neighbors, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and the more it will open the door for al-Qaeda. And sadly, that is what has now happened. Syria is in flames. Iraq has been destabilized. Jordan is under a lot of pressure because of refugees. Lebanon is barely holding together. And in the midst of this cauldron has emerged now this ISIL group, which is both larger and, it's hard to say this, but it is more vicious, I think is the only word, than even al-Qaeda under Zarqawi. Estimates of foreign fighters of between 10 and 15,000, at least 100 with American passports, thousands with European passports, which allows them to go home and come to the United States without the need of a visa. So we have now, straddling Syria and Iraq, a terrorist threat more fearsome than the al-Qaeda that we were able to defeat in Iraq, and one that will at some point get to attacks on the United States. That's the one thing we know about these groups. We can count on it. And the question is, do we want to take them on now? Do we want to take them on later? My preference would be now. So what does it require? This is not about Americans returning to Iraq and going into Syria with the tens of thousands of troops. That's not what's on the table. I was at a thing called the Aspen Strategy Group, and we heard from three very senior Sunni leaders, and we heard from Masoud Barzani, and all of them said the same thing. We can handle ISIL. We don't need and aren't requesting American boots on the ground, American combat forces. But we do need air support, we do need intelligence, we do need equipment, modern equipment comparable to what the bad guys have, and we'd like some advisors and trainers. If you give us that, we will take the fight to ISIL, and we can defeat them. And that is the opportunity that is available to us. I think it's a good thing that the administration has started to provide equipment to the Kurds. The paper today says that the French, the Germans, and maybe the British are going to join that effort. That is good news. I believe that the administration's intention is that once there is a unity government in Baghdad that is not headed by Maliki, they will begin a process of re-equipping, retraining, and resetting the Iraqi military. And finally, there will be a difficult choice about whether we will also begin to have a similar relationship with the Kurds, with the Sunni militia in Anbar province, who are going to take some time before they're going to reconcile themselves to the presence of the Iraqi army. So there is, I think, a way forward to handle this threat. We need to get after it. It is not going to get easier the longer it takes. And I think, despite their reluctance, my own view is that events are going to drive the administration there. It's just a matter of time, and I just hope it's sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just want to ask the panel. I'm going to ask a few questions before we open it up to the floor. But what do we do about Syria? I mean, that's you know, if you're able. I assume these were Iraqi Sunnis you were talking about, Steve, or the Kurds. Doing something in Iraq. I mean, the origins of this is in Syria. The capital of ISIS or ISIL or Islamic State is in Raqqa. And Syria is a complicated issue for us to deal with as well. So I'm not necessarily asking you, but please feel free to take that. I'd also be interested in what the rest of the panel thinks about that.
When I start, we'll go down the line.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. You can't handle ISIL just in Iraq. Their base is still in Syria. So in addition to the things I talked about in terms of Iraq, we have to do what the press reports we are doing now with the CIA in the lead, which is vetting, arming, and training non-extremist elements in Syria. For the moment those elements exist, they have a two-front war. They're being attacked by the Syrians. They're being attacked by the extremists. They need to be strengthened. They need to be enhance their ability to take the fight to both groups. And at some point, if we make some progress, I think the Assad regime will begin to split apart. And the only thing I can see as a next step is putting together some unity government of the elements that we've armed and trained and some elements of the Assad administration that are willing to break from Assad into a unity government that will begin to bring down the violence, begin to stabilize the situation, and begin to take the fight against ISIL in Syria. Stabilizing Syria is going to be a long-term prospect. I don't know what it's going to look like. The Syrian people decide, but I think that's where we have to start. Thank you.
Mary?
I couldn't agree more in the sense, you know, the argument that we have to take this seriously as sort of one system that is all the way across the border from Syria to Iraq. First of all, that's how ISIS thinks about it. They spent some time bulldozing the natural barrier between, or unnatural barrier, I should say, between Iraq and Syria, and proclaiming in their public videos that they had no intention of respecting borders all the way across the Middle East. So, and the unification of Iraq and Syria into one battlefield has already happened. So this is not something that we're doing. It's something that has already occurred and that we have to deal with. So I agree completely. We must see this as one system. The biggest problem that I see with dealing with the problems in Syria are the fact that there's been a radicalization of a very large percentage of the fighters in Syria. So I don't want to minimize the problems that we'd be having in seeking to find those who have an interest in creating not just a stable Syria afterward, but one that is non-extremist. However, we do have one potential ally that also stretches all the way across the borders, and that is, of course, the Kurds, who are present in Syria as much as they are in Iraq, or almost as much as they are in Iraq. So the proposal I would have is to begin with, as Mr. Hadley said, with arming and training the Kurds in Iraq to act as the sort of our partners in this fight, but then consider doing the same sort of thing in Syria with their brother tribes just across the border. other than that, again, this is a very tough situation in Syria, and I think we'd have to have some very careful vetting to make certain that our weapons don't end up in the hands of, for instance, al-Qaeda, who, while I have just said is not as bad as ISIS, I am by no means giving them the stamp of approval to arm them to take on. It's just not the right thing to be doing. So, but if we can do that kind of careful vetting, I think that this is the only sort of solution for what's going on in this entire system.
Steve?
And just, we also need not forget about Iran. You know, some of our allies, the Saudis, the Qataris, have supported some of the more extreme elements in the resistance against the Assad regime because they considered Assad, Hezbollah, and Iran, that Shia configuration, to be more of a threat to them than the radical Sunnis. I think they're probably rethinking that support now that ISIS has pivoted back, coming into Iraq and looking at the rest of the region as well. At least I hope they are. We've got to get those people on board too. This has to be a true regional response to this kind of threat, and it's got to include some of those Sunni-led countries that are nominally our friends, but who make their own interest calculations in this, because otherwise, you know, their fear of Iran is going to drive them to do things that are counter to our interests, and I think counter to the actual regional interests. But again, they have to look at that. You know, they're worried that, you know, our rapprochement with Iran is making them feel a little unsure about their own future vis-a-vis Iran, and that's causing them to make some bad decisions. And so that's going to take some high diplomacy, more than just finger wagging and public pronouncements. It's going to take that hard work behind closed doors, but that countries are supposed to do with one another to try and get people to make the right call.
Good, Mary.
Yeah, I forgot one of our natural allies in Iraq, besides the Kurds, are, of course, those Sunni tribal members who worked with us during the so-called awakenings. And my understanding is that they're still eager to work with us. I'm not quite certain why, given the way we've been treating them over the past few years. But it would be, I think, not amiss for us to pick up those relationships that we built over the course of 2006 to 2011 in particular, and to consider working with them. And might I also point out that ISIS has gone after specific tribes that have risen against them in Syria as well. So that there are specific tribes in Deir el-Zawa, for instance, that might be open to working with us. And given our previous experience in working with these particular Sunni tribes in Iraq, we might find that transfers over to Syrian tribal structures as well, although they are significantly different from those in Iraq.
Where's ISIS heading? I mean, are they going to try to just consolidate this Syria and Iraq, or does it go beyond that? I mean, where do we think that they're heading strategically in terms of the region, or are they going to talk about Jordan, Saudi Arabia? I mean, anybody have any thoughts on that?
No, I'll go first on
this one. All right.
You know, we made a mistake prior to 9/11 in not believing al-Qaeda when they said, we're at war with you. And, you know, we blew it off. We did not think they were serious. And I hope to heck we're not going to blow off what ISIS is saying. You know, I get it if you want to disagree about the analysis of things and one American analyst versus another American analyst and their opinions, but when the organization themselves says, this is our plan, it's to take over this part of the world, and, oh, by the way, we really want to put the flag of Islam over the White House. You know, that's kind of bold talk, I realize, and I'm not expecting them to come over the beaches down there, you know, on the East Coast anytime soon, but they are going to try and expand their ability. They've shown an ability to operate on multiple fronts simultaneously. They're fighting in Syria, they're fighting in Iraq, they try to do some operations near Jordan, they try to do some operations in Lebanon. They've got a lot of capacity to do mischief. So they're not going to just stick to the one area. I think they are going to try and expand themselves. And if we let them get away with it, they'll keep pushing. So we need to stop them on all those fronts.
Well, Mary's the expert here, so we'll let her go last, and she can tell you what's wrong with the things that I've said. I think, and I've had this conversation with some people in the administration. For the moment, ISIL's objectives are to consolidate power. They have a war on the Shia, and they've now extended their war to sort of everybody that isn't their particular brand of Islam. But I think you're going to see that move for a couple reasons. ISIL was thrown out of al-Qaeda, but they are now outshining al-Qaeda because they are doing better than al-Qaeda core, for example, in Pakistan. We're now beginning to see, at least so press reports, I don't see any intelligence anymore, press reports that the al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and the al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula are thinking of moving their affiliation from al-Qaeda core and Zawahiri, who is the head of it, to al-Baghdadi and ISIL. I also think that what we know about al-Baghdadi, he's very good and he's an ambitious man, and I think he will try to basically absorb all of al-Qaeda and displace Zawahiri. And as he does this, I think he will be affected by the al-Qaeda agenda, which is much more global and which really sees America as the ultimate enemy. Mm. And that's why people who I know are sometimes saying, well, ISIL is focused on the region. Yeah, we have allies in the region, but they're not focused at us. Let's not push them too hard because we don't want them to turn their attention on the United States. I think the history of these groups is they will get to the United States at some point, and you want to try, and I would argue, to hit them and deal with them early, because the stronger they get, the larger they get, the more entrenched they get, the more difficult they will be when they finally turn on the United States.
Yeah, Mary, can you talk about the threat to the United States? I mean, there's this sense that it's over there. It's not here. And do you think the threat is here and now? Is it coming once they consolidate themselves, or what's your sense of that? The threat to the homeland and how they might do that?
I have two sorts of responses to that. One is the sort of ideological vision that they have, and then the second would be what they've actually done and said. So their ideological vision begins with the fact that the Islamic State, as they call themselves now, is actually the caliphate. So for most of us, I think the word caliphate doesn't mean precisely what it once did. So I'll explain their vision of what the caliphate means. And it's also, by the way, not precisely what most ordinary Muslims think the term means. So in their vision, there can be only one caliphate, which was traditionally in Islamic history actually not true. And there can be only one ruler of the entire Muslim majority world, or the Muslim community, as sometimes it's put. So that's their vision. But beyond that, the caliphate is supposed to expand until the word of God is the highest, as they put it, and that means the entire world is ruled by their extremist version of Sharia. So in their vision, they already begin with a concept that is global in scope. But whether the United States would be a particular target or not, is a separate question. The fact is, however, that they have expressed a desire to attack the United States and to kill Americans. Will that displace their immediate desire, however, to take on, as they put it, the Shia homeland of Iran, or the Shia in general? That's a good question. But what we can see is that they are already putting out feelers into a lot of other countries to carry out attacks, not just on Shia populations, but on Sunni majority populations in places like Saudi Arabia, for instance. And that they also have had members that have expressed, at least individual members, expressed a desire to carry out attacks against the United States and have made threatening moves towards the United States. So there was a lone, I guess as we'd put him, lone jihadi who was picked up in New York just a few days ago. And then you have, as maybe some of you saw, the Twitter threat that was carried out by a supporter of theirs against the White House just a couple days ago. So the biggest threat I would imagine immediately, that is without a lot of planning on their part and coordination and so on and so forth, the immediate threat to the United States would be these 100 or so Americans, or possibly the thousands of Europeans and people with European passports who might carry out sort of lone jihadi attacks against the United States. And I would presume that unlike al-Qaeda, which has shown an ability to think long term, which has shown an ability to be patient and to wait for the right opportunity, that we would get immediate attempts to do things without waiting for some sort of long-term process. So the immediate threat could be, weeks, months away, rather than waiting, as al-Qaeda did, to carefully put in place the right, building blocks for some sort of huge attack. But I do not write out the possibility as well that they would carry out those kinds of careful attacks later on, once they've consolidated their territory and basically have in Afghanistan, in Syria and Iraq, to plot and plan.
Do you give any credence, Mary, I open this up to the panel, but I'll ask Mary, to these training camps where they're supposedly training foreign fighters to return to their native lands to undertake terror attacks?
Yeah. I don't know anything specifically about it. I'm sorry I haven't read anything about it, but I would be very surprised if they weren't doing it, right? The thing that's actually surprised me is the way that they've had terrible operational security with their foreign fighters out there bragging about what they're doing on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere, doing videos of themselves, carrying out atrocities without their faces covered. So that to me suggests this kind of sort of emotional kind of way that they run their organization, rather than a more rational way that al-Qaeda has run their organization. And the fact that, therefore, we're going to have a great deal of difficulty predicting what they're likely to do. If they simply want to go off and kill people without going through a lengthy planning process where we might catch them at some point during that process, then I think we're going to have trouble, because we might sort of be counting on a lengthy process and we might not get that.
The problem is they don't need training camps because they're getting on-the-job training in Syria and Iraq. They are in combat. And as somebody said, they're operating less as terrorists now and more as a very competent army. And their training is coming by killing people in Iraq and Syria every day. So it makes it much more immediate and much more dangerous.
Keep in mind, we've made a lot of points about the equipment, American equipment, that the ISIS has captured from the Iraqi military. But when they showed up in Iraq, they had a lot of equipment already. I mean, if you saw some of the early pictures of them operating, they had armored commercial vehicles, not just stuff taped on the sides. They were manufactured, that they got in Syria, either from patrons of that end of the resistance, or that they captured from the Syrian army. So these guys have quite a bit of experience, and foreign fighters from all over the world, some of them the kind of the A squad sort of guys in their local arena, came to Syria to join the fight there, and now they're staying with them and attracting more to continue the fight in Iraq and the whole area. So these guys are actually pretty good. As Steve mentioned, they're doing mobile maneuver warfare. So they've made the step up from just straight terrorism. They're still using terrorism as a tactic as well, but they're operating as military units, so it's a lot more an insurgent army now than it is just a terrorist group.
I've been watching Shark Week with my 4-year-old this week. I'm sorry to outlets that are covering it to mention that, but so you think about predators, you think about the food chain, and you have to think about national security as well as besides Mother Nature. You've got the pro-Russian rebels, you got the Ukrainian army, and you got the Russian army. So when we're talking about ISIS, ISIS, or ISIL, what are their vulnerabilities? Do they have any predators? When you're thinking about this, could they be threatened eventually by other al-Qaeda groups? Could al-Qaeda core rally and present some sort of threat to them, or some sort of force against them? So before we move on to questions from the audience, but I just thought I'd throw it out there.
You know, the best thing we can do is to turn their tactics and their brutality against them. You know, this is why in 2007 and 2008, the Sunni tribes in Anbar province in Iraq joined with us to turn against al-Qaeda, because they had been a period of time under al-Qaeda rule, and they did not like the brutality of it. And these guys in ISIL are even worse. And you're beginning to, if you followed the press, there's some resistance in Mosul, for example, which they overran a couple months ago. They've been systematically destroying holy sites, artwork, any sort of traditional elements up there, and they're turning the population against them. And the trick of this is to enable the local populations to turn against these guys and throw them out. But these guys are brutal and they are vicious. It will take enormous courage for people to stand up against them, and they will only do it if they believe they will win, and they only will believe they will win if they know they have the support of the United States. And that's why what we do is so important.
I'd just like to add to that, because I think there might be a misconception about how the awakening actually worked in Iraq in 2006 through about 2011. The awakening did not simply self-arm, self-train, and then take on and defeat al-Qaeda without any help. In fact, there had been other tribal uprisings that were brutally crushed by al-Qaeda in Iraq. So it's not enough to simply have the population turn against you. As a military historian, I can tell you that the data says all an insurgency needs is 5 to 10% of the population on your side in order to carry out a successful insurgency. You do not need to have 51%. And even if a very large percentage of the population turns against you, if you are brutal enough, and these guys certainly have shown themselves capable of doing that, you terrorize the population into submission. And therefore, people in Anbar who turned against them were forced to carry out their attacks at night, to snipe, to do all sorts of minor things. And when al-Qaeda figured out who they were and came after them, it was only the intervention of the troops on the ground there, the American forces on the ground, that prevented them from being slaughtered, and then worked with them. Oh, maybe these guys can be our partners. Instead of thinking of this as red-on-red violence, maybe we can work with them. And that is really what turned a group of sort of vigilantes who were sick and tired of al-Qaeda into the awakening. Without the support and help of the United States, however, nobody would have been willing to risk their lives on the scale necessary to turn against them. And they wouldn't have had the support behind them necessary to take on and defeat these guys. So when I say that we should be working with the folks who we previously worked with in Iraq and perhaps find similar partners in Syria, it's going to take more than simply arming people at this stage. There's got to be more support than that. And I'm not saying we need to be there in force doing something, but we certainly probably need to have soft guys on the ground helping them and showing them that we really support them, and being able to bring in then air power, which was one of the deciding factors in some of the early battles in Anbar province against al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Yeah, to take Peter's analogy out there, I don't see any big predators right now, but we can darn sure create some, and that's what we need to do.
Did you say something about that? That's good. Okay. Why don't we open it up to questions now, if that's all right. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We have somebody with a microphone. If you just please identify yourself and let us know whether it's to a specific individual or to the panel in general.
My name is Joel Mandelman. For two questions for the panel generally. First, if we start supplying, and I personally think we should, heavy weapons to the Kurds, at some point, does this lead to Iraq being divided into 2 or 3 countries with a new Republic of Kurdistan and a separate Shia and a separate Sunni country? Because this is sort of what was planned after World War I, and then it never happened. And second...
Let's just take one question, so we can get around to as many people as possible, if that's all right. Does anybody direct that to anybody in particular, or the panelists?
There's a risk. But one of the things I asked Barzani when we had the video conference here 3 or 4 days ago was, is it too late for unified Iraq? And his answer was very interesting. He said, you know, we the Kurds have supported an independent, inclusive, democratic Iraq from the beginning. That's not what we got beginning in 2010 and 11 in particular. And he said, and basically he said, this will be Iraq's last chance. So there's a real risk there, but I think it's a risk worth running, and it's a risk we have to run if we're going to deal with IS. And interestingly enough, my understanding from the press is that Baghdad has approved the provision of military assistance to the Kurds, and that gives you some measure of how desperate even Baghdad views the situation.
Anybody else? No? Okay. Yes, right here.
When the Sunni, Paul Marengoff, when the Sunni awakening succeeded, the U.S. had the kind of boots on the ground that are now being ruled off the table even by this panel. There was also a government that the U.S. could influence because it was a huge player rather than kind of a supplicant as Obama almost is. I mean, given all that, is it realistic to think that under the current situations, the Sunnis will really take the risks of uprising, or are the Middle East, the so-called regional experts quoted today, unnamed by the Washington Post, correct in saying that it will take years, if ever, before the Sunnis really are prepared to commit themselves to a struggle against ISIS?
Yeah. So I have two reactions to that. First of all, it looks as if from the news reports that ISIS, when the offensive first occurred, was a member of a coalition that included a lot of so-called tribal, Sunni tribal members. And one can't help but wonder if their experience with working with the Maliki government had already radicalized them in the past. So when I and others perhaps are talking about Sunni tribal members, I think we're considering specifically those who we worked with in the past, who were members of the awakening and who know what they were dealing with whenever they took a look at ISIS. So, or al-Qaeda in general. So I would think it would be very targeted just at those people who already, we know, have rejected ISIS and don't want to work with them. And then that's the first response. The second thing, though, has to do with will they be capable of taking on and defeating these guys without some more serious boots on the ground? And that's a good question. I'm not certain. I do know, however, that they are willing to give it a try, that there's signs of some kind of resistance in a couple of different places, not just in Mosul, but elsewhere. And I think that if we are capable of arming them and we can bring in air power to support them, they at least will be able to take on and defeat the ISIS regular army that might confront them. Now, if we destroy ISIS's capability to carry out a regular fight and they revert to an insurgency, that gets a little bit trickier because air power alone will do nothing. And this is why I believe at some point we're going to have some kind of soft on the ground to help and support those partners who we do find.
Yeah, remember, I don't think any of us said we don't need boots on the ground. We're just saying you don't necessarily need American boots on the ground other than the soft forces. When I talk about boots on the ground, I'm talking about, like infantry battalions and brigades and divisions. These regional forces, if they are enabled with our soft guys and with that air power, and together, the confessional militias are, they're sort of talented amateurs. You've got to get some of these other forces in there, the Peshmerga, the Iraqi military. As I said, maybe some militaries from other regional partners. We need boots on the ground, but they don't necessarily have to be American ones, other than our soft experts controlling that air power. I think that can be our contribution, and a lot of logistical help as well, and we can see them have some success.
Let's make this a little harder than it already is. The other elephant in the room, besides Syria, which we addressed earlier, is Iran. So we'll go back to the questions here, but I have a question. What is Iran going to do when we talk about all of these sort of things, American soft on the ground, an air campaign, et cetera? So, because I think they can certainly complicate, not that they have any affection for ISIS, but how does Iran play into this?
I think you'll see Iran,
or anybody can answer that. You don't have to be you, Steve.
But I think you'll see Iran want to get involved. I mean, they already have Quds Force guys in Iraq working, particularly with some of the Shia militias. Some of those militias have already said they will not have anything to do with American help. They don't want any Americans around them. So, there could be a situation where they won't accept that kind of help from us. They may only accept it from Iran. It's going to be kind of tough. They're going to want to get their foot in the door, and given that we're already negotiating with them over all the nuclear stuff, it's a little hard to keep them totally at arm's length over this. And I think that's dangerous. I think it's a real risk above some of the others that we're already talking about. But to be honest with you, it's going to be tough to keep them out if this goes as regionally as I kind of painted it.
There's one, it's interesting. So Iran decided that they would tell Maliki he had to step down. Maliki has been, in some sense, closer to the Iranians than he's been to us in the last few years. And a militia group whose name I'm sure Mary knows that I've forgotten, that is armed by the Iranians and was a key supporter of Maliki, withdrew their support and put it to the new Haider, this Prime Minister designate. I think Iran understands and wants to have a stable Iraq next door. I think and I hope they've learned that the kind of Shia-driven agenda of Maliki won't work, and it will cause the country to break up, and you'll get the kind of violence you're beginning to see now that facilitated ISIL's progress in Iraq. So they have thrown their support to this new Prime Minister designate towards a unity government, and I am hopeful that that will constrain a little bit their role, because the Iranians know that if they become too prominent in Iraq, they become the issue, and they will then lead to the fracture of the unity among Kurds, Shia, and Sunni, which I think at least some Iranians understand you're going to need if Iraq is going to be stable. That's what we ought to be playing on in our conversations with the Iranians.
Mary, have any thoughts?
No. I think we've gotten the range of possibilities.
All right, let's go back to the audience. Do we have any additional questions? I think we have one over there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, one right there.
I'm sorry.
Yes, Dave Cochran from the Mitchell Institute. I've got a question for the panel. How much of the brutality and ambition of ISIS is centered around Baghdadi? And should our strategy, in addition to supporting the other factions that are not friendly to ISIS and the other governments in the area, how much of that should be on a decapitation strategy using our air power and ISR?
Go to it, Mary.
One of the interesting things about the Abbottabad documents that were released a couple of years ago was this vision, this small vision into al-Qaeda's organizational thinking. And one of the things they seem to have done was, and this must be post 9/11 because we have some of the documents that were captured after our invasion of Afghanistan that show quite a different way of thinking about it, that there's a lot of deputies running around, first deputies, second deputies, and so on. And this, I think, might be one of the explanations for why they've been so resilient, even though we spent a lot of time trying to decapitate the organization. But recently there were a couple of news articles that came out that talked about the organization of ISIS, and what struck me in reading that, this is Arabic language newspapers, was how flat their organization was, in the sense that you don't have all of these deputies and that there's just one guy who seems to be the center and in charge of everything. And I think this goes back, and that's of course Baghdadi, and I think this goes back to his vision of what the caliphate is supposed to look like, with one kind of despot in charge, and everybody simply obeys his orders. So I almost see this as, and this is actually the analogy I use for thinking about ISIS. They're basically the Nazis, right? And you've got a Führer in charge, and he's got a vision for the world. And if we had been capable of taking out, Hitler back in the day, we might have seen collapse of organization there as well. And I think the same kind of thing could happen here. By the way, I don't use the Nazi analogy lightly because I know how much it's abused, but these guys actually have Einsatzgruppen. And you know, I was reading this article from al-Quds al-Arabi in which they talk about the groups that they've set up to carry out their mass slaughter. And they sound exactly like what the Nazis set up in order to kill Jewish people in Poland and the Ukraine. So.
I would say it'd be worthwhile taking a shot to decapitate him because specifically he's portrays himself as a descendant of the prophet. That puts him, I don't think there's too many deputies out there, even if he's got some that can say that same bloodline. So it'd be worth taking him out just to see what happens.
I think we have another question. We have a question over here. Yes, it's coming.
Thank you. Speaking of regional partners that we might look to help us confront ISIS, as I understand it, there's a group centered in Mosul of former Ba'athist leaders. Since the Ba'athists were able to control the country formerly, and since we've even worked with the Ba'athists formerly, maybe that's the group we should support. On a more serious note, how significant is that group, and what is their relationship to ISIS?
I don't know of any relationship they have with ISIS. They, you know, their Ba'athists are secular, so I can't believe they get along all that well with them. And if they could recruit some of those guys, you know, a lot of them formed some of the major leadership of the former Iraqi army. It might be useful to get them to help. I'm not sure they're going to get any big leadership positions in anything just because people are still suspicious of that group. There's still a lot of bad feelings towards the Ba'athists with, you know, with justification.
I think we're gonna take another question or two, but the last question of the day is going to be from me, and I'll give you a little time to think about this. If you had the president's ear, and some of us have had the president's ear, what would you tell him to do about Iraq? So, cogently as we end the program, but right now we'll go to another question from the audience if we have one, and then I'll let you guys when we close up give us your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jarjah. I'm from Senator Mark Kirk's office. The question that I have is there's been quite a lot of focus on arming militias, the Shia militias, Sunni tribal leaders, as well as the Kurds. What should be done, on the other hand, to help out the IA, the Iraqi army, stabilization, maybe reshoring competence in the military? Of course, this is the medium term, but what should be done?
There's a huge agenda there. I think the administration will do it. They've been slow to do it because they have not wanted to look like they were shoring up Maliki. So I think they're really holding back until they get this unity government under a new prime minister. And I think once that happens, you'll begin to see this re-engagement with the Iraqi security forces, which obviously ought to be the main focus of what we do.
Does that answer that?
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mohammed Kardar. Just following up on the question on the importance of Baghdadi's leadership, how do you see the counter-radicalization element in terms of our strategy? Stephen mentioned the Westerners that are with Western passports that are there, in terms of the longer-term picture of those individuals that are getting battle experience, entrenching their radical views. And I feel like the counter-radicalization discussion has not been as strong as it once was. How do you see that as a priority in terms of picking it up, if it's more of a long-term thing or actually quite important to the strategy in dealing with things on the ground now? Thank you.
Mary and I are smiling because we spent a lot of time on this in the Bush administration. It's something we all knew was a priority. We never figured out how to do it effectively. It's still a priority, and I'm still not sure we know how to do it.
Yeah, I agree. The thing that we have learned from these extremist groups, however, is that nearly always they discredit themselves. So what they actually promise people justice, they promise people morality, they promise people a better way of life than the one that they currently have. And what they actually deliver then is such a contrast with what they promise that really I think the only thing we need to do is take advantage of that contrast between what they say and what they actually deliver. Especially when it comes to ISIS, because the difference between them has been immense and really just needs to be taken advantage of. But I think you're also asking about those people who've already bought into their ideology and who have are going about, carrying out some of these atrocities. I think that there's very little that can be done about it, and we've seen all sorts of things attempted in lots of different countries. I have a friend who works with people, actually she used to work with people who have a dual diagnosis. That is, they have both an addiction and they have a mental illness. And she also worked with people who have personality disorders. And she said, for one, we actually have treatment. We have ways of helping people. Lots of things to help people with addictions, lots of things to help people with mental problems. But when you have a personality disorder, the only actual cure is prison. So I feel that what has happened here is you are dealing with people who have been radicalized and participated in massacres, and it's unclear to me that there's any solution other than prison.
Is ISIS gaining steam, losing steam, holding their own? Are they getting more foot soldiers? Are they getting more money other than the stuff they've stolen, in terms of equipment or things along that line? Are they gaining support? Where's that at? I mean, it looked like they became this big, perfect storm, and
Yeah.
Where's it going?
Well, I've been paying very close attention to this, and they are getting small bits and pieces of established groups to swear what's called bayat to them, that is, this oath of fealty to them. But if you take a look at the established groups, sort of as a whole, they're not winning over the majority. So just a couple days ago, the big established group in Indonesia, it's not that big, but the established group in Indonesia, known as Jamaat al-Tawhid, went through a huge upheaval when the head, a guy who I think is still in prison, Bashir, swore an oath of fealty to ISIS. And there was a huge uproar about this and split the group, but it looks like the majority may have actually left him and formed another group. So some percentage, it includes his own son, disavowed him. So it looks to me like they're getting tiny splinter pieces to grow up with, join up with them. But they are getting enough people to as they call it, migrate, carry out hijra, as they put it, to Iraq and Syria to replace losses. So that's disturbing. At least it looks like that. And they have carried out they've had a couple of minor victories recently in towns. At the same time, the Kurds managed to carry out a successful offensive against them as well and take back a couple towns. So it looks like stabilization, maybe.
Is funding? Anything on funding? Anything on funding? Do we know if they're drawing funding at all? No.
They have lots of money. They have sucked up a lot of money as they move down the Euphrates and you move down the Tigris, and so money in the short run, I'm afraid, is not their problem. But a real opportunity for us now is to target their financing, because we know in the end of the day, these groups, particularly when you're running these large military operations, they run on money. So again, the first shot after 9/11 was to go after terrorist financing. We should be focusing on ISIL's financing with a lot of attention.
Let's take one more question right over there, and then
Yeah, how's it going? Robert Moore from Senator Mike Lee's office. Mr. Hadley, you spoke a couple times about the U.S. acting or some things starting to come together once there's a unity government in Baghdad. It seems like that's still a long way from happening, both in terms of Maliki stepping out of the way and then something actually forming behind that. Can you speak both to the reality of actually getting a unity government in Baghdad that encompasses all three parts of Iraq in a reasonable way that they can agree on, and then if that's not able to happen, what does that do to this kind of strategy that I think all three of you agree with about having some sort of regional force to take on IS as kind of with the Iraqi Defense Forces in the middle of that?
Yeah.
Can Iraqi Defense Forces rally too?
The head of the Iraqi Defense Forces said their loyalty is to the country, not to Maliki. And that's a good thing because he's, kept the defense portfolio for himself. Look, intelligence people are pessimists. They tell you what's going wrong and why it's going to get worse. And policy people are optimists. They tell you how to fix what's wrong and to get better. So I've made a life of sort of being a policy person. That means I'm an optimist. So you have to take what I say with that in mind. But the press reports from 2 days ago, there was a detailed report that the new prime minister actually is very close. He's got a Shia bloc, he adds the Kurdish bloc, and he's beginning to collect Sunni blocs. So he's probably got the votes he needs now, the majority of the Council of Representatives to form a government. He's got 30 days to do so. He's probably about 5 days of run. My guess is he'll get together a government. Iraqis have a way of getting it done, not at the 11th hour, but at the 13th hour. We've seen that a lot. But they do have a tendency to get it done. Maliki, here's my hope for Maliki. Maliki, and he re-emphasized this when I last saw him when he was last in Washington. He's a big Constitution guy. His view is if you let go of the Constitution, Iraq has lost its future. I'm hoping that what he does is when he gets this ruling from the Constitutional Court saying that the president was in his rights to ask Haider al-Abadi to form a government, that Maliki will use that as an opportunity to step down and say, I insist that it be in accordance with the Constitution, that's my job. I disagree, but the Constitutional Court has now said that this is constitutional. I therefore relent. His problem is the day after he leaves office. He doesn't want to be killed, he doesn't want to be prosecuted, and he doesn't want to be humiliated. And the question really, I think, is can they work out a deal that gives him some satisfaction on those points? Because I don't think this is a case of his leaving the country. I don't know where he'd go. And my reading of the man is that's not who he is. So I think, in a way, the last piece of this, if he's going to step down, will be, which I think he will, they're going to have to assure him on security, pride in a place, and that he's not going to be prosecuted. And that's going to be hard because there are a lot of people who've been cracked down and prosecuted and thrown in jail under the Maliki regime.
All right. All right, the last, Steve, do you want to say something on that?
No.
No, okay. Let's, so if you had the president's ear, what would you tell him?
I've already said mine, but I'd say we need to take action more than what we're doing now. We need to continue the relief of the Yazidis and any other minority groups that are facing potential genocide. We need to develop a true regional coalition to go after these guys, including Saudis, Turks, Jordanians, Brits, French. The Czechs have offered stuff. Get in there with the Kurds, the Yazidis themselves, the Iraqi military, the Shia and the Sunni militias. Embed them with U.S. Special Operations Forces. Maybe the Brits or the French can provide some SOF as well. Then get in there with heavy, much heavier than we've used thus far, air support from the United States and from some of those Western allies that have more advanced precision munitions. Those are not, by the way, perfect munitions. They're precision. They still sometimes hit the wrong people, but we do better than most. And the goal should be the destruction of ISIS.
Okay. Mary?
So from on the ground to really high up, 30,000 feet, my proposal would be that we stop reacting to events and that we develop a strategy for the region. Because I feel like we are constantly saying, wow, that happened, now what do we do? And so I'd like to see a real strategy for dealing not just with ISIS, but there are also al-Qaeda in Syria and elsewhere. And so I'd like to have a real strategy. And as you say, the objective of that strategy should not be simply as I think the strategy is currently to avoid entanglements, foreign entanglements, if one might say, but rather to defeat the extremists. So I'd like to see a strategy with that goal.
I think I agree with what Mary and Steve have said. I think that's exactly right. The trick is, given his history and given his instincts, how do you get the president to embrace those suggestions? And I think what I would try on him is to say, Mr. President, you've decried the partisanship that has severed relations in Washington. You're absolutely right. It's terrible. We need to try to find an issue that unifies the country, and ISIL is that issue. It is a threat to the homeland. It is something every American can understand. It is something you can rally Republicans and Democrats behind, both Republicans and Democrats in the Congress and Republicans and Democrats in the country. There will be fringes on the extreme right, extreme left that won't go along, but I think the vast majority of the American people will. So this is an opportunity, Mr. President, for you to help pull the country together. Secondly, it is an opportunity for you to show real leadership, to take this issue, to explain it to the American people, and to lay out a program for dealing with it. This is an opportunity for you to really step forward and, quite frankly, Mr. President, rebut those critics who unfairly criticize you for not showing enough leadership. This is an issue for you. And it is important to do, Mr. President, because I think there's a good chance that how you react to this crisis will have a major impact on your legacy. And I would try it. I don't know if it'd work, but that's what I would try.
We've had a rich, thoughtful, and informative discussion today on this very, very important topic. Please join me in thanking Steve Hadley, Mary Haybeck, and Steve.